Hello, and welcome to Whisper Garden, a quiet corner of YouTube where gentle stories help you slow down, unwind, and drift off to sleep. You'll find a new sleepy time tale here every week, told in soft, soothing tones, designed to calm your mind and ease you into restful slumber. I'd be so grateful if you'd like this video and subscribe to the channel. It's a small gesture that makes a big difference and helps more dreamers like you find their way here. Sweet dreams. Our story for tonight is The Clockmaker's Cat. In a fog-laced town where time ticks softly, a clever cat winds the world to sleep, until one night she finds a clock that changes everything, just enough to let dreams linger. The Clockmaker's Cat. Chapter 1. In the mountain town of Millhaven, time moved like honey through winter air, thick, golden, and impossibly slow. Days stretched themselves like lazy cats in sunshine. Yawns arrived hours before they were expected, and nobody minded at all. The postman delivered mail when the light felt right, rather than when schedules demanded. Children walked to school with unhurried steps, their lunch pails swinging in gentle arcs that matched the rhythm of their own heartbeats. Even the town's 3 dogs seemed to understand that haste was unnecessary here, preferring to nap on sun-warmed porches rather than chase anything that moved. The town nestled in a valley where morning fog gathered like a soft gray blanket, carrying the scent of pine needles and mountain streams that had been singing the same gentle songs for centuries. Weathered wooden houses climbed the hillsides in no particular hurry, their gardens spilling over with foxgloves and lamb's ear that grew wild and untroubled. Porch swings creaked in rhythm with mountain breezes, and screen doors sighed shut with the gentleness of an exhale held too long and finally released. Mrs. Chen tended her herb garden with the patience of someone who understood that good things couldn't be rushed. Her grandmother had taught her that thyme grew stronger when planted during the full moon, that rosemary thrived on gentle words spoken at dawn, and that some plants would only share their healing properties with hands that moved slowly enough to listen. The old woman's wisdom lived on in the way Mrs. Chen's fingers found exactly the right herbs for exactly the right ailments, as if the plants themselves whispered their secrets to her weathered palms. At the bakery, Thomas Chen, Mrs. Chen's nephew, though everyone simply called him the baker, rose each morning when his body told him it was time, not when any clock insisted. His bread emerged from stone ovens when it had finished its patient transformation from flour and water into something that could nourish both body and soul. Regular customers knew to arrive when they smelled yeast and happiness drifting down Main Street, understanding that the best bread couldn't be hurried any more than the best love could be scheduled. The Murphy house stood on Elm Street like a gentle giant, its wraparound porch adorned with hanging baskets that Mrs. Murphy had been tending for 43 years. Inside, a grandfather clock kept time with the measured dignity of someone who had seen generations of children grow up and move away, leaving only photographs and the echo of laughter in rooms that remembered every birthday party, every Christmas morning, every quiet evening when love was measured not in grand gestures, but in the simple act of being present. But every evening at exactly 7 o'clock, something remarkable happened that united every corner of Millhaven in a moment of perfect synchronization. Every timepiece in town, grandfather clocks in parlors, cuckoo clocks in kitchens, pocket watches tucked in vest pockets, the church bell high on the hill, chimed in perfect unison. The sound rose from the valley like a prayer made audible, notes overlapping and weaving together into a harmony that seemed to echo from the mountains themselves. Mrs. Chen would pause while hanging laundry, her hands still on a cotton sheet that smelled of lavender and mountain air. Old Pete would lift his hat as he passed the church, the same gesture of respect he'd offered every evening for 40 years. The Baker twins, ancient men who still met each afternoon for checkers on the general store porch, would stop their eternal game and listen with expressions of wonder, as if hearing the chimes for the first time. Children playing in Memorial Park would grow quiet, their games forgotten as they turned toward the sound with faces full of something that might have been recognition, though none of them could have said what they were recognizing. Dogs would prick their ears and cats would pause mid-stride, all of them sensing something in the synchronized chiming that spoke to parts of themselves older than training or instinct. The harmony lasted exactly 1 minute and 17 seconds. Not that anyone counted, but somehow everyone knew. As the last note faded into the mountain air, the town would release a collective breath it hadn't realized it was holding. Families would gather their children, shopkeepers would lock their doors with unhurried hands, and everyone would settle into the gentle rhythm of evening, feeling held by something larger than themselves. No one questioned this daily miracle. No one wondered how clocks made by different hands in different decades could possibly keep such perfect time together. In Mill Haven, some mysteries were meant to be felt rather than solved, like the way morning fog made everything look softer, or why the mountain stream always sang the same gentle song regardless of season. The synchronized chiming was simply part of the town's heartbeat, as natural and necessary as the sunrise that painted the peaks gold each morning. What the townspeople didn't know, what they couldn't have imagined, was that their evening harmony was the work of someone who moved through their world unseen, adjusting and tending and caring for time itself with the devotion of a gardener, nurturing flowers that bloomed in moments instead of seasons. And in the woods that crowned the mountains, like a dark, peaceful shawl, other clocks kept their own time. Wild clocks that measured seasons instead of seconds, marking moments too deep and slow for human ears to follow, waiting patiently for someone to remember what time could be, when it wasn't rushing toward tomorrow, but savoring the eternal gift of now. Chapter 2. At the very edge of Mill Haven, where the last cobblestone surrendered to forest path and wildflowers grew between the cracks of civilization, stood a cottage so thoroughly embraced by nature that it seemed to have grown from the earth itself rather than been built upon it. Virginia creeper climbed the walls in lazy spirals, its leaves changing color with the seasons like nature's own calendar. The roof sagged gently under the weight of moss and tiny wildflowers that had taken root in the old cedar shingles, creating a living crown that shifted from green to silver to gold as sunlight moved across the sky. Morning glories wound around the porch railings with the determination of lovers unwilling to let go, and clematis draped the windows in curtains of white and purple stars. The chimney released smoke that carried the scent of cedar and chamomile throughout the day, a gentle perfume that marked the cottage's presence in the woods, like a signature written in cloud and breeze. Inside this verdant sanctuary lived Mr. Oswin Bartleby, a man who had not set foot beyond Mill Haven's borders in 37 years, 4 months, and 16 days. Not that he counted, but time had a way of marking itself in the lines around his eyes and the silver that had slowly conquered his hair. He was a small man, made smaller by decades of bending over tiny mechanisms that required the delicacy of a surgeon and the patience of a saint. His shoulders curved like parentheses around a life spent in quiet concentration, and his fingers had developed the permanent tremor of age fighting against the steady precision his work demanded. Thick spectacles perched on his nose, always slightly smudged despite his frequent cleaning, with a soft cloth he kept in his coat pocket. He wore heavy woolen sweaters even in spring, their sleeves bearing the permanent perfume of cedar oil, brass polish, and Earl Grey tea, scents that had become so much a part of him that they seemed to emanate from his very skin. Bartleby's days followed the rhythm of a perfectly regulated timepiece. At dawn, not clock dawn, but the moment when light first touched the mountain peaks, he would shuffle to his kitchen in felt slippers that whispered against worn wooden floors. The kettle went on to boil with the ceremonial precision of a daily ritual that connected him to the simple certainties of heat and water and the promise that some things in life could be counted upon to behave exactly as expected. While waiting for the water to reach its perfect temperature, He would slice bread for toast, spreading it with marmalade that Mrs. Chen made from oranges that somehow grew sweet in the mountain air, a small miracle that tasted like sunshine preserved in amber. He ate slowly, watching steam rise from his teacup like tiny spirits seeking heaven. And for those quiet moments each morning, the weight of solitude felt less like burden than like companionship, with the essential silence that lived at the heart of all things. His workshop occupied the cottage's largest room, a space that seemed to exist outside normal concepts of organization or physics. Hundreds of clocks in various states of repair lined shelves built from driftwood and dreams, their cases ranging from simple pine boxes to elaborate carved mahogany that told stories of craftsmen who had poured their souls into wood and brass, and the eternal human desire to make sense of time's passage. Some clocks ticked with the robust health of youth, their mechanisms humming with well-oiled satisfaction. Others wheezed and stammered like elderly relatives sharing stories that grew more elaborate with each telling. A few sat in perfect silence, their springs unwound, their faces stopped at moments that might have marked great joys or profound sorrows, though in Bartleby's workshop, every silence was treated with the respect due to grief that had found its own perfect expression. The air in the workshop carried a symphony of overlapping tick-tocks that somehow never clashed but wove together like a complicated lullaby sung by a choir that had been practicing together for decades. Pendulums swayed in gentle hypnosis, their brass weights catching afternoon light and casting patterns on the walls that shifted like slow dancers moving to music only they could hear. Bartleby would spend his mornings here, fingers dancing over tiny mechanisms with the delicacy of a pianist playing a nocturne written in gears and springs. He could diagnose a clock's ailment by sound alone. The slight wheeze that meant a pivot needed oiling, the hesitation that suggested a spring had lost its tension, the irregular rhythm that spoke of grief held too long in chambers too small to contain such sorrow. But he was never alone in his work. Curled on a cushion of faded velvet that had once been deep purple but had mellowed to the color of twilight, sat his constant companion, a smoky gray tabby named Thistle. Her fur rippled with silver stripes that caught light like clock hands, pointing to moments of perfect contentment, and her amber eyes held flecks of gold that seemed to glow with their own inner light, as if she had swallowed stars and kept them burning in the chambers of her heart. Thistle moved with balletic grace that made even the simple act of stretching look like choreography. Each step seemed deliberate and purposeful, never knocking over the smallest gear or disturbing the most delicate spring, as if she understood intuitively that this was a place where precision mattered more than speed, and patience was the highest virtue. Around her neck hung a peculiar accessory that no one in town had ever noticed during daylight hours. A tiny satchel made of felt, so fine it might have been woven from moonbeams, stitched with threads that shifted between silver and gold depending on how the light struck them. The satchel was impossibly small, yet seemed to contain depths that defied ordinary understanding of space and capacity. "The balance wheel needs gentle encouragement," Bartleby would murmur to Thistle as he worked, his voice soft as tissue paper worn thin by years of careful use. "Can you hear how it wants to find its natural rhythm again?" And Thistle would rise from her cushion with fluid grace, pad silently to his workbench, and settle beside him with the contentment of perfect understanding. Her purr, adding its own bass note to the workshop's eternal symphony. During the town's 7 o'clock chiming, Bartleby would pause whatever repair occupied his hands and listen with Thistle to the great harmony that rose from the valley below. A smile would play at the corners of his mouth, not triumphant or proud, but tender, like someone listening to a lullaby that carried the voices of everyone he had ever loved. After the last note faded into mountain air, he would return to his work with renewed purpose, knowing that somewhere in Millhaven, families were gathering their children close, lovers were sharing quiet words over dinner tables, and elderly couples were settling into chairs by windows to watch the last light fade behind peaks that had stood sentinel over countless generations of human joy and sorrow. In the evenings, Bartleby would prepare his simple dinner: soup from vegetables that grew wild in his untended garden, bread with butter and honey that tasted like concentrated summer, tea that released steam carrying promises of rest and dreams. As darkness settled over his cottage like a familiar blanket, he would wind his personal clocks, timepieces that kept private time, marking moments too personal for the world to hear. Then he would settle into his chair by the fire with Thistle on his lap, her purr mixing with the gentle tick-tick of 100 patient hearts, and together they would drift towards sleep as the cottage breathed around them like a living thing, holding them safe in a world where time moved at the speed of love, and every moment lasted exactly as long as it needed to say what it had come to say. Chapter 3. When the last light faded from Bartleby's workshop and gentle snores drifted from his bedroom like autumn leaves settling into their final resting places, Thistle would rise from her velvet cushion with the silence of smoke ascending towards stars. The transformation was subtle but complete. Where daylight revealed an ordinary cat blessed with unusual intelligence and grace, darkness unveiled something altogether more mysterious. The tiny felt satchel around her neck, invisible to human eyes during waking hours, began to shimmer with its own soft radiance, revealing tools so delicate they might have been crafted in workshops where angels learned precision. From its impossible depths emerged instruments that belonged in fairy tales: a golden screwdriver thin as a pine needle but strong as faith, a silver hammer no bigger than a dewdrop yet capable of the most intricate adjustments, and tiny vials of oil that caught moonlight and held it like liquid starshine. The cottage door, which remained locked to everyone else in Millhaven, opened for Thistle with the whisper of hinges that had learned to recognize the footsteps of purpose. She would slip into the night air, her silver-striped fur rippling like water under the moon, and begin the work that gave meaning to every day in the valley below. Through the sleeping town she moved, a shadow with mission, her route mapped not in her mind, but in her heart, where each clock lived as a distinct voice in an eternal choir. Every timepiece called to her with its own personality: the grandfather clock in the Murphy house that wheezed slightly on the quarter hour, from living so long in rooms that remembered more laughter than walls should be expected to hold; the kitchen clock at the bakery that ran 3 minutes fast from decades of proximity to ovens that never quite cooled; the delicate mantel clock at the library that ticked in perfect iambic pentameter, like poetry given mechanical form. At the Murphy house she would slip through the cat door they had installed for their own Tabby Oliver, a ginger Tom who had mysteriously vanished 3 years earlier, leaving behind only fond memories and a convenient entrance for visitors who understood the sacred nature of nighttime repair work. In the parlor, the grandfather clock stood like a wooden sentinel, its brass pendulum swaying with the tired persistence of someone who had been keeping faithful time for 87 years without complaint. Thistle would climb its carved sides with steps so light they made no sound, even on the creakiest boards, her claws finding purchase in wood grain worn smooth by decades of faithful service and gentle polishing. Inside the clock's tall body, she worked magic that combined technical precision with something deeper. An understanding that clocks were more than mechanisms, that they were repositories of memory and hope, keeping time not just for the present moment, but for all the moments that had come before, and all those yet to arrive. With her golden screwdriver, she would adjust the escapement mechanism, listening to the way the gears wanted to sing together rather than simply function. Her silver hammer would tap out adjustments so gentle they sounded like raindrops on leaves, each tiny impact releasing years of accumulated tension and allowing the clock's voice to ring clear and true. When the mainspring needed attention, she would produce a vial of oil that smelled like morning dew mixed with starlight and apply exactly 3 drops, never more, never less, to the pivot points that governed time's heartbeat. The kitchen clock at the bakery required different medicine altogether. Living so close to heat had made its metal expand and contract in irregular rhythms, like a runner struggling to catch breath after a race that never ended. Thistle would cool it with her touch, her paws somehow drawing the fever from its brassworks until it settled into the steady contentment of a mechanism that remembered how to keep perfect time. She carried with her packets of herbs, thyme for steadiness, lavender for peace, rosemary for remembrance, and would sprinkle tiny amounts into the clock's mechanism like a master chef seasoning a beloved recipe that had been passed down through generations. At the library, the poetry clock needed only listening. This remarkable timepiece had somehow learned to tick in iambic pentameter, its rhythm matching the natural meter of human speech when speech becomes song. Thistle would curl up beside it, purring in harmonics that matched its natural rhythm until the clock remembered how to keep perfect literary time. Tick-tock, tick-tock, like the heartbeat of a sleeping sonnet or the breath of a dreaming ballad. House by house, room by room, clock by clock, Thistle tended to Millhaven's relationship with time itself. She oiled the sticky bits that made minutes drag like Monday mornings, adjusted the hurried parts that made hours race like children running toward birthday parties, and whispered to the lonely mechanisms that had been forgotten in back bedrooms and dusty attics, reminding them that they still had purpose, that their quiet ticking still mattered to the great symphony of temporal order. Each clock was a friend with its own personality and needs. The cuckoo clock at the general store had grown melancholy from too many years of watching customers buy necessities without joy, so Thistle would wind its spring with extra tenderness and oil its tiny bird with drops of liquid laughter until its hourly song rang out with renewed enthusiasm. The alarm clock on young Sarah Chen's nightstand ran fast from eagerness to wake her for school, so Thistle would slow its escapement just enough to let the girl enjoy a few extra minutes of dreaming each morning. She knew the intimate details of every timepiece in town, which ones needed encouragement to keep running, which ones needed gentle restraint to prevent them from rushing ahead, and which ones simply needed the comfort of knowing that someone cared enough to visit them in the dark hours, when the rest of the world slept peacefully. By 6:30 each evening, Thistle would have completed her circuit, ensuring that every clock was ready for the great chiming that united Millhaven in its daily moment of perfect harmony. She understood with mathematical precision how long each clock's voice would take to travel through evening air, calculated exactly when each mechanism needed to release its song so that all would arrive at human ears in perfect unison, creating the illusion that time itself was singing. At 7 o'clock sharp, Thistle would position herself on the church steeple, watching her handiwork come to fruition with the satisfaction of an artist whose invisible masterpiece was performed fresh each evening. The town would fill with layered chimes, each voice distinct yet harmonious, creating a symphony that seemed to rise from Millhaven's very foundations and echo off the mountain peaks that stood guard over the valley like ancient sentinels. As the last note faded into the mountain air, carrying with it the hopes and dreams of everyone who had paused to listen, Thistle would make her way home through streets filled with the contentment of a job invisibly, perfectly done. Bartleby never knew of these midnight journeys, sleeping deeply through Thistle's nocturnal symphony of care and precision, dreaming the peaceful dreams of a man whose world kept perfect time thanks to pause that understood the difference between maintaining clocks and nurturing the very essence of temporal harmony. But sometimes, in the space between sleep and waking, he would hear the whisper of tiny feet on wooden floors and smile without opening his eyes, sensing in his dreams that time itself was in the most capable hands, or rather the most devoted paws, that had ever taken responsibility for the sacred duty of helping moments find their perfect rhythm. Chapter 4. On a night when the moon hung like a silver pocket watch against velvet sky, casting shadows that danced with unusual purpose, Thistle completed her customary rounds with the deep satisfaction that comes from work done with precision and love. The town's clocks hummed in contented synchronization, their mechanisms purring like 100 satisfied cats, settling into perfect comfort. She had just finished her most challenging repair of the evening, convincing the stubborn kitchen clock at the post office to stop running fast, as if it were eager to deliver tomorrow's mail before yesterday's sorrows had been properly processed and filed away. Pausing on the church steps where moonlight pooled like spilled cream, Thistle pricked her ears toward an unusual sensation that had nothing to do with sound and everything to do with absence. In the deep woods that crowned Millhaven, like a sleeping giant's abundant hair, there lived a silence that didn't belong. Not the peaceful quiet of forest at rest, but the hollow space left behind when music stops mid-phrase, waiting for someone to remember the forgotten verse. She had grown accustomed to the forest's nighttime symphony, the whisper of wind through pine needles sharing secrets older than memory, the gentle creek's eternal conversation with stones that had been listening to the same stories for centuries. But tonight, there was a pause in that ancient music, a held breath that felt like anticipation stretched too thin to remain unbroken much longer. Following intuition that ran deeper than thought, Thistle traced the silence to its source, down cobblestone streets that gleamed like fish scales under moonlight, past the last cottage where Mrs. Chen's garden grew wild with night-blooming jasmine that released its perfume like prayers offered to sleeping stars, and on to the forest path that wound upward into mystery. Her paws made no sound on the carpet of fallen needles and moss that had been accumulating for decades, creating a walking surface soft as dreams and twice as forgiving. The silence grew stronger as she climbed, pulling her forward like a tide of unheard music seeking its missing instruments. Ancient pines towered overhead, their branches weaving patterns of shadow and silver light that shifted with each breath of wind, creating a constantly changing ceiling of natural cathedral glass. Somewhere in the darkness, the mountain stream spoke in whispers that carried the voices of every raindrop that had ever found its way to the sea. And night creatures rustled through undergrowth that smelled of earth and time itself. The path wound higher, through groves where wildflowers bloomed in colors that only moonlight could properly reveal. Blues that looked black in daylight, but sang with indigo luminescence under stars. Whites that glowed like captured snow, purples so deep they seemed to hold pieces of the night sky within their petals. Morning glories had closed their faces for the evening, but their vines traced silver spirals up tree trunks like nature's own clockwork, marking time in seasons rather than seconds. Then, nestled in a hollow between two hills where the forest had created its own secret room, Thistle saw something that made her amber eyes widen with recognition and wonder. A clock tower rose from the earth like a fairy tale made manifest, neither large nor small, but perfectly proportioned in the way that dreams sometimes are, when they carry more truth than waking life dares to believe. Its wooden sides had weathered to the color of driftwood, kissed by decades of salt spray. Though the nearest ocean lay hundreds of miles beyond the mountain peaks, the copper roof had turned green as sea glass, patinated by years and weather into something more beautiful than any artificer could have planned. Vines embraced the tower like gentle arms that had been waiting patiently for this reunion, their leaves creating natural curtains that parted just enough to reveal glimpses of clock face beneath. Morning glories wound around the base in spirals that seemed to follow some mathematical principle known only to flowers and time itself, their closed buds waiting for dawn to reveal colors that existed nowhere else in the waking world. But the most remarkable thing about the tower was not its unexpected presence in this hidden grove, but its profound and complete silence. Thistle approached with the reverence of a pilgrim approaching a shrine where miracles were not promised but remembered. The clock face, barely visible through the curtain of ivy that had grown with protective purpose, showed no hands. The Roman numerals had faded to ghost shadows on wood worn smooth by wind and rain, and the patient passage of seasons that had learned to wait without counting. She climbed the tower's sides with care that bordered on ceremony, her claws finding purchase in weathered wood and gaps between stones where roots had worked their way through with the slow determination of love that refuses to be deterred by obstacles. Moss cushioned her steps like green velvet prepared for a very small, very important guest, and tiny flowers released their perfume as she passed. Sweet pea and wild rose, lavender and something that smelled like childhood summers when time moved slowly enough for wonder to take root and grow into wisdom. At the top, she found the clock's face up close, and the mystery deepened into something that felt less like puzzle and more like recognition. The hands hadn't disappeared through decay or theft. They had simply stopped, frozen at 3:03, as if time itself had paused mid-breath to listen to something too important to interrupt. The minute hand pointed upward like a prayer reaching toward heaven, and the hour hand stretched toward the 3 like someone reaching across an impossible distance to touch what they loved most. Through gaps in the clock face, Thistle could see into the mechanism's heart, and what she found there took her breath away. Gears sat motionless, their teeth locked in mid-conversation, like friends who had been interrupted while sharing their most important secrets. Springs coiled in permanent tension, holding their breath for a release that had been delayed, but never abandoned. The pendulum hung still as a sleeping thought, waiting for the first push that would set everything in motion again. But this wasn't abandonment or neglect. This was slumber so deep it had become its own form of meditation. In the mechanism's heart, Thistle could sense something dreaming, something that had chosen to pause at 3:03, because that moment contained everything worth remembering about why time mattered at all. The clock wasn't broken. It was simply sleeping so peacefully that it had forgotten the urgency of waking, content to dream about all the perfect moments it had witnessed, all the love it had measured, all the hope it had helped to count down to manifestation. Everything was covered in moss, so soft it looked like velvet cushions prepared for a gathering of very small, very patient guests. Tiny flowers bloomed from the pivot points where gears would normally turn, their petals opening and closing in rhythm with some unheard heartbeat that pulsed through the tower like the memory of life itself. In its dreams, the clock held memories that made Thistle's whiskers tremble with recognition, visions of lovers who had met at 3:03 in the morning, when the world was quiet enough for hearts to hear each other clearly, children born at that precise moment, when night balanced perfectly with approaching dawn. The clock had been built not just to mark hours, but to honor moments that mattered, the spaces between tick and talk, where life actually happened, where love was declared and grief was processed and hope was born fresh each day, regardless of what yesterday had taken away. It measured not duration but significance, not passage but presence, not time but the eternal now that lived in the heart of every moment that had ever been fully experienced. Thistle settled on the clock face with infinite gentleness, her paws touching the frozen hands with the reverence due to something sacred that had been waiting longer than memory for exactly this moment of discovery. Through her touch, she could feel the mechanism's dreams flowing like water through chambers that had been holding their breath for decades, and in those dreams she saw the truth that made her purr with recognition and wonder. This clock had been waiting for someone who understood that time wasn't just measurement but magic. Someone who knew that the most important moments couldn't be scheduled or planned, but only felt. Someone who cared enough about temporal harmony to spend their nights ensuring that every clock in every home sang its part in the great symphony of synchronized significance. The realization came to Thistle like dawn, slow, then sudden, then inevitable as sunrise. This sleeping timepiece was ready to wake up, but not to keep ordinary time. It wanted to wake into something larger, something that would teach the very concept of time, how to hold what mattered most, without letting precision become more important than purpose. As she sat with the sleeping clock under the watching moon, surrounded by the patient breathing of the forest that had been guarding this secret for longer than human memory, Thistle began to purr. Not her usual contented rumble, but something deeper, older, like a lullaby sung backward to call someone home from dreams too beautiful to leave voluntarily. The sound echoed softly in the hollow hills, mixing with night air until even the mountain stream paused to listen, and in the mechanism's heart something stirred like a sleeper feeling the first touch of morning light through windows that had been closed too long, ready at last to open and let the new day begin. Chapter 5. The sleeping clock's dreams were older than memory, deeper than the roots of the ancient pines that stood guard over its secret grove. As Thistle's purr vibrated through its wooden heart with the resonance of a bell struck in a cathedral of eternal silence, she could feel the mechanism stirring, like a person slowly surfacing from the most peaceful sleep of their life, reluctant to leave dreams that had become more real than reality. But waking this clock would require more than mechanical adjustment. It would require an understanding that transcended the simple relationship between gears and springs, demanding instead a recognition that time itself could be transformed from measurement into music, from duration into devotion, from passage into presence. Thistle opened her tiny felt satchel, and from its impossible depths, which seemed to contain entire workshops filled with instruments that existed only in the dreams of master craftsmen, she withdrew tools that shimmered with their own inner light. These weren't the ordinary implements she used for the town's clocks: golden screwdriver, silver hammer, vials of starlight oil. These were older tools, made of materials that had no names in any human language, forged in workshops where the boundary between magic and craftsmanship had been forgotten so completely that the distinction itself had become meaningless. A spindle carved from crystallized moonbeams that held within its core the memory of every perfect night when lovers had whispered promises under stars. Thread spun from spider dreams, so fine it was nearly invisible, yet strong enough to hold together the gossamer connections between moments that mattered. Needles forged from the memory of first snow, carrying the sharp clarity of winter mornings when the world felt newly made and full of possibility. She slipped through a gap in the clock face like smoke seeking its source, entering the mechanism's cathedral with the reverence of someone who understood that she was crossing the threshold between the ordinary world and a place where time itself was born fresh, each moment from the marriage of precision and wonder. Inside, gears towered above her like sleeping giants from an age when clockwork was indistinguishable from prayer, their brass teeth gleaming with the dull luminescence of metal that had been dreaming for so long it had begun to glow with its own inner light. Springs coiled in perfect spirals, holding their breath for the moment when tension would transform into motion, when potential would become kinetic, when waiting would finally resolve into the eternal dance of tick and talk. The pendulum hung motionless at the heart of it all, waiting for the first push that would set everything in motion. But Thistle could see that this wouldn't be a simple matter of winding springs or oiling pivots. The clock's decades of dreaming had grown into its very structure, like ivy taking root in the walls of an ancient castle, not as decay, but as evolution, creating pathways for magic instead of mere mechanics. Moss had woven itself between the gears with the intelligence of a master weaver, creating organic clockwork that would allow time to flow like water finding its own level, rather than marching with military precision toward destinations that might not matter as much as the journey itself. Tiny flowers bloomed from pivot points like hope sprouting from the most unlikely soil, their petals opening and closing in rhythm with heartbeats that belonged to the forest itself. She began at the mechanism's heart, the escapement that would govern how time flowed once the clock awakened from its long sleep. Here, a spider had built its web between the gear teeth, with the patience of someone who understood that the most important work happened slowly, one strand at a time, until something beautiful and functional had been created from raw possibility and unwavering dedication. The web pulsed with morning dew that caught moonlight like tiny prisms, each droplet holding within itself the reflection of the entire cosmos, reduced to its essential elements: light, water, time, and the magic that happened when all three recognized their fundamental kinship. Thistle understood immediately that this wasn't neglect or abandonment, but intentional design, part of the clock's transformation from simple timekeeper into something that could teach time itself how to be worthy of the moments it was privileged to measure. With her moonbeam spindle, she began to adjust the web's tension with the delicacy of a harpist tuning strings that would soon sing harmonies never before heard in the waking world. Each adjustment taught the web to release time in gentle sighs rather than harsh tick-tocks, allowing seconds to unfold like flower petals opening to receive the first light of dawn. The spider watched from its corner with eyes that gleamed with ancient wisdom, accumulated over countless nights of patient web spinning. And when Thistle's work met its approval, it nodded once with the dignity of a master craftsman recognizing excellence in another's hands. Next, she climbed to the main spring, where decades of accumulated dreams had crystallized into something that looked like frozen music, if music could be made visible and then preserved like amber, holding the memory of ancient forests. The spring didn't need traditional winding. It needed to be sung back to life, called home from the realm of dreams where it had been resting and gathering strength for the moment when it would be needed most. Thistle placed her paws on the crystallized dreams, with the gentleness of someone handling butterfly wings or newborn hope, and began to purr in harmonics that matched the frequency of joy itself. Not the desperate happiness that fears its own ending, but the deep contentment that comes from knowing that some things are so fundamentally right. Slowly, like ice remembering how to be water when touched by spring sunshine, the crystal began to warm, then glow, then transform back into the potential energy that would drive the clock's new heartbeat. Colors flowed through it, like aurora dancing in a sky made of time itself, and Thistle could feel the dreams being translated back into mechanical possibility without losing any of their essential magic. The gears came next, each one requiring its own form of awakening that honored both its mechanical function and its role in the larger symphony of temporal harmony. Some needed oil made from liquid moonlight, applied drop by precious drop to bearings that had forgotten how to turn but remembered how to dream about turning. Others needed the touch of spider silk thread, woven between their teeth to teach them how to mesh, not just mechanically, but musically, so that each rotation would contribute its own note to the chord that would soon ring out across the valley like a bell made of time itself. As she worked, Thistle became aware that the woods around the tower were holding their breath with the intensity of an audience waiting for a symphony to begin. The mountain stream had stopped its gentle babbling, its voice caught between one word and the next. Night birds perched motionless on branches that had suddenly become the rafters of a vast concert hall. Even the wind paused between the pine needles, as if all of nature was waiting for this moment of resurrection, this return of something precious that had been sleeping too long in the secret places where magic goes to rest and gather strength. Each gear sang its own note as Thistle awakened it, some deep as cello strings, others bright as piccolo trills, all of them finding their place in a harmony that seemed to emerge not from mechanical precision, but from the recognition that every part of the whole was essential, irreplaceable, worthy of care and attention. The most delicate work came last, setting the hands that would once again mark time's passage. But time transformed, time that had learned to hold what mattered most, without losing sight of what was yet to come. These weren't ordinary clock hands, but had evolved during their long sleep into something like compass needles that pointed not to magnetic north, but to the heart of whatever moment needed to be held, cherished, extended just long enough for its full meaning to be absorbed and appreciated. Thistle took them in her paws with infinite care, feeling their weight, which was simultaneously negligible and enormous, like holding feathers that contained the mass of mountains, or stars that weighed no more than wishes. They vibrated slightly with their own eager energy, ready to begin their eternal dance around the face of time, marking not just hours and minutes, but the spaces between heartbeats where love lived, the pauses between words where understanding bloomed. With infinite care, she positioned them not at 12 o'clock for a traditional fresh start, but at 3:03, the moment when they had stopped, the moment they had been dreaming about all these years, the precise point in time when the clock had decided that some moments were too beautiful to leave, too perfect to rush past in the name of progress or efficiency or the relentless forward motion that characterized so much of human experience. Then came the moment that would determine whether decades of dreaming could successfully transform into waking reality. The pendulum hung before her like a prayer waiting to be spoken, a breath waiting to be taken, a heart waiting for its first beat in a body that had been carefully prepared to sustain life, but had never yet experienced the miracle of animation. Thistle gathered all her strength, all her understanding of what clocks could become when they transcended their role as mere measurers of duration and became, instead, guardians of significance, keepers of meaning, protectors of the moments that made existence worth its inevitable cost, in heartbreak and loss, and the terrible beauty of knowing that everything beloved would eventually pass away, but that passing away made presence more precious rather than less. With the gentlest possible touch, no more pressure than a butterfly landing on a flower petal, no more force than a sigh finding its way past lips that had been holding secrets too wonderful for words, she gave the pendulum its first push back toward life. The response was immediate and transformative. The pendulum swung with a grace that redefined the very concept of motion, its arc tracing patterns in the air that seemed to write poetry in a language made of pure movement. The gears began to turn with whisper-quiet precision, each rotation releasing notes that wove together into a chord that made the heart want to slow down and listen, that made time itself pause to appreciate the sound of its own voice finally finding the perfect pitch. The hands began their journey around the clock face, but slowly, so slowly that each second felt like a small gift rather than another step toward an ending that would come too soon, regardless of how carefully the moments were counted. Each tick was a whisper, each talk a gentle sigh, and together they created not the harsh percussion of mechanical time, but the soft breathing of time that had learned to love what it measured. But the most extraordinary thing was what happened to time itself in the space surrounding the awakened tower. As the clock's first whispered tick echoed through the hollow hills, a wave of perfect stillness spread outward like ripples on a pond that reflected not just the sky above, but the dreams below, the hopes that lived in the spaces between what was and what could be. Thistle felt it first, a sensation like being cradled in the space between one heartbeat and the next, held in the eternal now that existed in the pause between question and answer, between problem and solution, between longing and fulfillment. It wasn't the stillness of stopping, but the stillness of everything being exactly where it needed to be, exactly when it needed to be there, for exactly as long as it needed to remain in that perfect position. The feeling spread through the forest like honey poured from a great height, touching every tree, every flower, every creature that called the mountainside home. Then it flowed down the mountain paths like a gentle tide of temporal magic, washing over the sleeping town below with the tenderness of a mother's hand, checking a child's forehead for fever, finding instead the perfect temperature of contentment. From her perch atop the newly awakened tower, Thistle could see Millhaven spread below like a child's toy village crafted by someone who understood that the most important details were the ones that couldn't be seen but only felt. Every window glowing softly with the light of lives being lived with purpose and care. Every clock face reflecting moonlight like tiny mirrors that had learned to hold not just reflections, but the essence of the moments they reflected. And for one perfect moment that lasted exactly as long as it needed to, which might have been seconds or hours or the space between one breath and the next, time itself took a deep, peaceful breath, exhaled slowly, and settled into a new rhythm that honored both precision and poetry, both measurement and meaning, both the need to move forward and the equally important need to sometimes pause and appreciate how far the journey had already come. The wave of temporal transformation rippled outward until it touched every clock in Millhaven, and every sleeping soul settled deeper into dreams that suddenly contained more color, more warmth, more hope than dreams usually dared to hold, as if the very air had been enriched with possibilities that made even unconscious minds smile in their sleep. Chapter 6. The wave of gentle stillness moved through Millhaven like a blessing made manifest, touching every clock, every heartbeat, every breath drawn in the deep sleep that comes to those who live in places where time remembers how to be kind. At 3:03 in the morning, when most of the town lay dreaming in beds that had cradled generations of peaceful sleepers, time didn't stop so much as it sighed, a cosmic exhale that gave everyone permission to linger in whatever moment they were already inhabiting. In the Murphy house, where the grandfather clock had just whispered its new note of contentment, with a voice that somehow carried echoes of every conversation it had ever overheard, old Mr. Murphy found himself caught in the liminal space between sleep and waking, where the most important revelations often occur. He had been dreaming of his late wife Margaret, and in the pause between seconds that suddenly felt infinite, her voice seemed to hang in the air like perfume that had learned to speak. "The roses need watering, dear," she had said in the dream, and now he could smell them. Not the memory of roses, which had grown faint and precious over the 7 years since she'd been gone, but actual petals and morning dew, and the rich earth that had cradled their roots, as if her garden still bloomed in some parallel dimension where love was stronger than endings, and care could transcend the apparent finality of death. The scent was so real he could feel tears forming behind his closed eyelids. Not tears of grief, but of gratitude for this gift of presence. This reminder that some forms of love plant themselves so deeply in the heart that they continue to bloom long after the gardener has moved on to tend other, more mysterious gardens, in places beyond the reach of ordinary time. At the bakery, where the ovens never quite cooled and the air always carried the promise of bread in various stages of becoming, Thomas Chen found himself paused mid-reach for the clothes he wore each morning when he rose at 4 to begin his daily alchemy of transforming simple ingredients into something that could nourish both body and soul. In that stretched moment, suspended between sleep and the beginning of another day's work, he smelled something that made his weathered hands tremble with recognition. Lilacs. Not just any lilacs, but the specific variety that had grown outside his grandmother's kitchen window in the house where he'd spent the most magical summers of his childhood, back when time moved slowly enough for wonder to take root and grow into wisdom. His grandmother had used those petals to make the most delicate cookies he'd ever tasted, their purple sweetness candied like edible jewels that dissolved on the tongue like concentrated summer. The scent was impossible. Those lilacs had been gone for 40 years, victims of a harsh winter that had killed not just the bush, but eventually the grandmother who had tended it with such devotion. Yet here was their perfume, filling his lungs with memories so vivid they felt more real than the present moment. And for reasons that bypassed rational understanding entirely, tears of pure joy ran down his face like rain that had been waiting decades to fall. At the library, where books slept on shelves like dreams waiting to be awakened by the right reader at the perfect moment, young Sarah Chen, Mrs. Chen's granddaughter visiting for the summer, had fallen asleep in the reading chair with a collection of lullabies open on her lap. The poetry clock nearby kept its perfect iambic rhythm with the satisfaction of a timepiece that had finally found its ideal environment. In the pause at 3:03, the book's pages began to flutter, as if turned by invisible fingers that knew exactly which song needed to be found. And Sarah heard, clear as crystal bells ringing across water, a melody her mother used to sing during the difficult years when her father's work kept him traveling. She heard it not as memory but as present reality, as if her mother stood beside the chair, humming the melody that had carried her through countless childhood nights when the world felt too large and uncertain for a small girl to navigate alone. The song wrapped around her like arms that had learned to comfort across the impossible distance between then and now. And in her sleep, Sarah smiled with the peace of someone who had just been reminded that she was loved beyond the reach of time or circumstance. The sensation rippled through every home, every heart, like stones dropped into a pond that reflected not just the sky above, but the dreams below. Dogs found themselves dreaming of perfect walks where every scent told a story worth investigating for hours, where no human voice ever called them away from the important work of discovering what the wind had been doing while they weren't paying attention. Cats purred in harmony with something larger than their own contentment, their small bodies vibrating with frequencies that seemed to connect them to the mountain itself, to the ancient patience of stone and the eternal cycle of seasons that made even the shortest feline life feel part of something magnificent and enduring. Even the goldfish in Mrs. Patterson's bowl, a simple glass universe that contained more wonder than most people ever bothered to notice, seemed to swim with extra grace, as if the water itself had become music they could dance to, as if their small lives had suddenly been revealed as part of a choreography too vast and beautiful for any single observer to fully comprehend. On the hill above town, the church bell felt the pause and resonated with a single, soft note it had never made before. Not the bronze toll that called people to worship or marked the hours of ordinary time, but something warmer, more intimate, like a mother humming to a child who couldn't sleep, or a lover whispering endearments that were too precious for anyone else to hear. The sound drifted down the hillsides and through the streets like a benediction made audible, touching every ear that was willing to listen, and every heart that remembered how to receive unexpected gifts with grace. But perhaps the most extraordinary transformation was what happened to dreams themselves throughout Millhaven. The boundary between sleeping and waking grew thin as morning mist, permeable as the membrane between one moment and the next. People found themselves dreaming while awake and living while asleep, caught in a space where the two states overlapped, like pages in a book, being slowly turned by hands that understood the story needed time to reveal its deeper meanings. Mrs. Chen, who had been sorting herbs in her kitchen while insomnia kept her company with its familiar restlessness, suddenly found herself standing in her grandmother's garden at the age of 7, watching those patient, weathered hands demonstrate which plants could heal heartache and which could mend spirits that had been broken by the simple cruelty of a world that often moved too fast for proper healing to occur. The lesson was absolutely real. She could smell the earth that had been turned that morning, feel the sunshine warming her small shoulders, hear her grandmother's voice explaining that time was for courage when facing the unknown, rosemary for remembrance when memory felt like the only thing standing between present pain and future hope, lavender for peace when the heart couldn't find rest in its own unquiet chambers. When the moment passed and she returned to her midnight kitchen, she looked down to find her hands had been sorting herbs with perfect accuracy, grouping them exactly as her grandmother had taught her all those decades ago, creating combinations that her conscious mind had forgotten, but her heart had preserved, like pressed flowers between the pages of a book that was only opened when the most important healing was needed. The town doctor, who had been sitting beside a patient's bed at the small clinic that served the valley with quiet competence, felt the pause settle over him like a warm blanket woven from all the comfort he'd ever received in his own moments of need. In that stretched second, he saw clearly how to heal the elderly woman's persistent cough, not with medicine alone, which treated symptoms without addressing causes, but with the tea his own family doctor had prescribed when he was a boy. The recipe came to him complete and perfect. Honey from bees that fed on wild flowers, herbs that grew on the mountain slopes where the air was thinnest and purest, water from the spring that had never known contamination, all combined with the kind of patient attention that recognized healing as partnership between remedy and faith, between treatment and the body's own deep wisdom about what it needed to become whole again. Even the mountain stream that ran through Millhaven's heart seemed to slow its eternal conversation with the stones, each ripple catching moonlight for just a little longer than physics should have allowed, each bubble rising to the surface with unusual deliberation, as if the water itself had been given permission to take its time and truly appreciate the journey from source to sea, from beginning to transformation to return. Fish hung suspended in the current like thoughts that had found their perfect moment to surface, their scales catching reflected starlight and holding it like tiny mirrors that showed not just the sky above, but the infinite possibilities that lived in the spaces between what was and what could be. From her perch on the awakened clock tower, Thistle watched the transformation unfold with the satisfaction of an artist whose invisible masterpiece was finally being appreciated by an audience that understood its true value. She could see the soft glow emanating from every window, feel the contentment settling over the town like snow that fell upward instead of down, carrying away worries and leaving behind the kind of peace that made even the smallest moments feel worthy of celebration. This was what the forest clock had been dreaming of during its long sleep, not the stopping of time, which would have been a kind of death, but the savoring of it, the recognition that some moments deserved to be held a little longer, not because they were perfect, but because they were present, because they were real, because they were happening now, and would never happen again in exactly this way. The pause lasted exactly as long as it needed to, long enough for every dream to find its dreamer, every memory to find its home, every heart to remember what it felt like to be perfectly still and perfectly content at the same time, to exist in the eternal now that was always available, but rarely accessed by minds too busy planning tomorrow to fully inhabit today. Then, gently as a flower opening to receive the first light of dawn, time resumed its normal flow, but it carried with it the echo of that perfect stillness, the memory of a moment when the whole world had paused to appreciate the simple miracle of being alive and aware and present in the same instant, of being part of a story so large and beautiful that even the smallest role felt significant beyond measure. As the last ripples of temporal magic settled into the mountain air like dew that would nourish the morning flowers, every clock in Millhaven released a quiet sigh of satisfaction, and every soul settled deeper into whatever dream or waking thought was carrying them toward dawn, trusting that time itself had just reminded them of its greatest secret, that love makes every moment eternal, and eternity lives in every moment that is fully experienced, rather than simply endured. In the days that followed, the people of Millhaven woke to find their world subtly transformed, as if someone had adjusted the very essence of reality, making colors deeper, sounds clearer, and ordinary moments somehow more significant than they had ever been before. Mrs. Chen's herb garden had rearranged itself overnight, plants grouping together in combinations that her grandmother's voice whispered would heal ailments she hadn't even known she remembered. The baker found himself making cookies with lilac petals, following a recipe that came to him complete and perfect, as if downloaded from memory itself rather than learned through trial and error. Children played games that seemed older than childhood, singing songs in languages nobody had taught them, but everyone somehow understood. And every evening, when 7 o'clock approached with its promise of temporal harmony, the synchronized chiming had changed in ways that made hearts race with recognition they couldn't name. The clocks still sang together, but their voices had grown softer, more melodious, like a lullaby that could carry grown adults back to the safety of childhood bedrooms, where monsters lived only in stories, and every ending was guaranteed to be happy. Some claimed they could hear an additional voice in that evening's symphony, a deeper, older chime that seemed to drift down from the forested hills like the voice of the mountain itself, learning to keep time. Children would point toward the woods when they heard it, their faces bright with the certainty that something wonderful lived up there among the pines and morning glories, something that understood the difference between measuring time and treasuring it. In his ivy-covered cottage, Bartleby had settled into a new rhythm that felt both foreign and familiar, like returning to a language he had spoken fluently in childhood but had forgotten until this moment, when memory suddenly flooded back with crystal clarity. But Thistle knew something Bartleby was still learning. The clock in the woods was already complete in every way that mattered. On the night of the new moon, when darkness settled over Millhaven like a gentle blanket, Thistle made her decision. She sat on the cottage's front step, gazing up toward the forest path that led to the hollow hills where their creation waited with the patience of something that understood eternity. Bartleby found her there when he came out for his evening pipe, the heart gear in his coat pocket, where it had lived for 3 days like a talisman of completed hope. "You want me to come with you?" he said, understanding flooding through him as he looked into her amber eyes. "You want me to see what we made together." Thistle stood with fluid grace and walked to the forest path, then paused to look back at him with an expression that managed to be both patient and encouraging. For 37 years, she had been his companion in solitude. Now she was offering to share something larger, the completion of a love story that had been written in gears and springs and the elastic nature of time itself. "Lead the way, old friend," he said, stepping onto the path that led upward into mystery. "Lead the way home." The woods welcomed them like returning children who had been missed more than they had known. As they walked, Bartleby found his breath coming easier than it should have, his legs carrying him upward without the protest of age. The heart gear in his pocket seemed to pulse with its own warmth, guiding him toward the moment of reunion it had been waiting for since the day Elena had painted it with colors mixed from joy and starlight. And then, as they crested a gentle rise between 2 hills, Bartleby saw it and felt his heart stop, then restart, then begin beating in a rhythm he hadn't felt since youth, the rhythm of recognition, of homecoming, of love that had been separated from its beloved for far too long. The clock tower rose from its hollow like a dream made manifest, exactly as their drawings had envisioned, but more beautiful than either had dared hope. It was ticking, not with harsh precision, but with the gentle rhythm of a sleeping giant's heartbeat, creating a lullaby that made the entire forest seem to breathe in contentment. "It's been waiting," Bartleby whispered, his voice full of wonder. "All these years, it's been waiting for us to remember what we created together." They climbed the spiral staircase together, past mechanism chambers where gears turned like dancing flowers, past levels where springs coiled and released in rhythms that matched the mountain's own geological heartbeat. And finally they reached the top, where the clock face glowed with gentle phosphorescence, and the hands moved in their eternal dance, around symbols that Elena had painted with tears of joy. In the center of the mechanism's heart, Bartleby could see the space where the heart gear belonged. A hollow shaped exactly like the piece in his pocket. He drew the gear from his coat with hands that had found their young steadiness again. "This is for you, Elena," he whispered to the night air. "Our gift to a world that moves too fast for wonder." He placed the heart gear in its waiting home, and the universe held its breath. The gear settled into place with the softest possible click, like a key turning in a lock made of starlight. Immediately the clock's rhythm deepened, became richer, gained harmonics that seemed to echo from the valley below and the peaks above. And then Bartleby heard it. Elena's laugh, warm and eternal, carried on the night wind like a blessing that had been waiting 37 years to be delivered. Not memory this time, but presence, woven into the clock's new song, proof that some bonds were too strong to be broken by anything as temporary as death. "Thank you," her voice seemed to say, arising from the mechanism's deepest heart. "Thank you for finishing what we started. Thank you for believing in forever." The clock tower pulsed once with gentle light, sending ripples of completed magic down through the hills and into the sleeping town below. In Millhaven, every timepiece sighed with deep satisfaction, and every dreaming soul settled more peacefully into sleep. knowing that somewhere in the darkness, time itself was being kept by hands that understood love's true rhythm. Bartleby and Thistle sat together on the tower's roof as dawn approached, watching the stars fade into morning light that painted the valley below in colors that had finally learned their own names. The clock sang its new song behind them, not loud but sure, marking moments with the patience of stones and the tenderness of lullabies. Some said afterward that if you walked in the woods on certain nights, you could hear that ancient timepiece keeping its patient watch, time moving at the speed of love, proving that some bonds are stronger than time itself, some love more durable than the mechanisms that attempt to contain it, and some stories too beautiful to end, even when their final pages have been written and their lessons learned by heart. The end. May your dreams be gentle. May your sleep be deep. And when you wake, may you carry a little peace with you. If you enjoyed tonight's story, feel free to return anytime. Good night and sweet dreams.